Let us start without further ado. Friedl, I would like to start with a question for you. You've worked as a photographer and a filmmaker for quite a long time. You have your own kind of signature style, if I can say that. It's always very similar to the film that we've seen tonight. 16 millimeter black and white material, hardly any post-production. Either it's silent or there's a kind of voiceover, sometimes singing a cappella like the one we've seen tonight. So for everyone in the audience who really enjoyed this film, there's more. You can check it out. My question would be, when I prepared for this presentation, I watched the film. I was actually really struck by the force of the lyrics of that song. And when I watched it, I didn't remember that it was the Seeräuber Jenny song. I don't know if all of you in the audience knew that it's the Pirate Jenny song from the Threepenny Opera from Brecht, Hauptmann, and Weil from the late 1920s. But my feeling was that actually the lyrics and the song gained in force when you like decontextualized it the way you did. It's actually stronger, the sentiment, than in the play or in the two films that were made after the play. Because here it really feels like this class revenge fantasy, I think. And I was wondering whether that was your intention when you made the film. And then there is the title, Uscita di sicurezza, emergency exit. And I would like to know how that relates to that revenge fantasy. And maybe you can also say something about the woman who features prominently in the film. I think Angela Crupano, is it? Yeah. Yes, thank you.
Good evening. I want to say that I'm not educated, not in filmmaking, not in singing, I started to work when I was 15 years, so I don't have what you call here Abitur and in Austria Matura. I didn't study. But I went to school in DDR in Prenzlauer Berg for how do you call it, ground school, from 6 years to 11 years. And this gets even stronger as I'm older now. So this has to do with the expression of the song. My parents, nobody studied. My daughter studied, but nobody, not my 3 siblings, not my parents, nobody was interested in culture. But Brecht was an exception. And Brecht was in the time, I'm talking of 1951 until 1957, that we had been in Berlin. So Brecht was something which was, together with my education as a pioneer, both parents communist, was very strong and very influential. And maybe when you get older and older, you will see that the past, the childhood, comes back quite strong and quite surprisingly. So this for the expression of the song, because if you see the Beggars operas, and these are educated voices, and I think it's really funny how they sing together with the theme, what it means. So I did not have somebody. I work without script, without producer, without assistants, and without post-production. So I can make a film whenever I want. And what you saw in the end is just the copies for Sixpack Film to distribute. So I can film whenever I want, and like that the films look like. This is then my style. The camera is not as perfect as I wanted, because I'm a professional photographer, and I know that you should maybe hold the camera like you have seen in the other films today, but I can't do it. And it's I get used to this, and I like it very much. And as you said, it is it became my style. And in fact, I want to encourage everybody to live like that, not to be adapted and not to. And therefore, I'm quite glad that I did not study filmmaking, because if I would, I would. I'm sure it would be completely different.
Maybe just one word about the woman.
The woman I saw, it was the cheapest supermarket in Pavia, which is a little town. Adriano may know it, little town near Milano. You know it. It's nice, no? So on the edge of the city, or nearly on the edge, is a very cheap supermarket where I bought things, and I saw her. And even I cannot speak very well Italian, and she doesn't speak English, then I said, I would like to film her. But the boss did not allow somehow. I don't know, she didn't have time. She lived somewhere else. So, but she came out in a 15-minute pause, and I filmed her. And then I took also photographs of her, because I was not sure if the film portraits are quite well. And photography is now very important for me, because in photography you can really judge the split second and film this split second, and it's much easier to make nice portraits. What you see in the end of the film, I don't know if you saw it. Some are filmed, some portraits of Angela, but at the end there are these portraits, and I filmed them again, and so it's a much more expression which I'm longing for than when I would.
And does she know about her kind of role in the film, the character that she kind of plays?
No, not until now. But I thank Dietmar Schwärzler is here, and I thank Sixpack and Dietmar Schwärzler, because I printed postcards. And of course, I went there and gave her postcards, and she was very proud. I also sent her in a letter, very nice enlarged photographs, but I didn't pay her. I nearly don't get paid. I know the subject of.
Yeah, it's another subject we
Yeah.
could talk about. Moving on to the second film we saw tonight, to Vika, Kirchenbauer. Vika, you work as an artist, but you're also professor at a school for fine arts in Braunschweig. You work in the film and video section. And out of your many different artworks, I would like to mention one film that you made 3 years ago, which is called Capacity for Adequate Anger, because I think this is very much corresponding with the film that we saw tonight. That film was very personal, very autobiographic, but it also talks about the relation between social class and the art world very much. So what we saw tonight was maybe the most difficult film, I guess, for some parts of the audience to watch. I have to admit it was not easy for myself when I watched it at home on the laptop. But there I had the possibility to stop and pause and think and then go on. But I think at least one thing is clear. It's about the first big public exhibition of artworks in London in the 1980 in the 18th century, so at the beginning of capitalism, you could say. And it's very much about the exclusion of the working classes, of different people from the working class, from that art world. So artists didn't want the poor to express their aesthetic judgments of their work, which I find really interesting. So that is really what you do in that work is like giving us elements of this long history of exclusion from certain social classes from the art world. And now my question would be, how do you see that related to today's situation? And is actually today's situation, was that the motivation for you to do all the research to make this film?
Thanks a lot. I just want to acknowledge that 3 collaborators are here tonight as well. Rita Macedo, cinematographer, Azadeh Sandi, who did the sound recording and mixing, and Judith Sieber, who did script and artistic advisor. Yeah, I think like what brought me to it was definitely like my kind of ongoing reflection on art institutions and their relation to class and difference. And I'm interested in the limits when kind of art institutions try to accommodate a changing discourse and try to be more inclusive on some sort of surface level. But there is a deep conflict with some of the notions that are at the core of these institutions. And so I was interested to go back and look at this kind of particular instance, because oftentimes I think when we think about kind of the narrations of kind of European art history, usually we look at the Louvre as the birth of the museum, which I think is also complicated as like a genesis, but more palatable, more like easier to identify with, because it's the French Revolution, the revolutionaries like take the royal collection, make it the people's collection, open it up for the people to see art. And but this happens earlier, and as you've seen, a lot more complicated, and also shows that I think the class exclusion that you point to is one important aspect, but another important aspect is kind of art's relation, both materially and ideologically, to colonialism. And so that this kind of exclusion of kind of a white working class public and the expropriation and exploitation of people in colonies, that went hand in hand. And that I think often we think that colonial violence or class-based violence stands in some sort of contrast to notions of beauty or the capacity to have taste or something like that. But that art played a very active role, that was not only implicated, but very active in seeking the support of arms dealers, colonial barons, and so on. So this is at the core. And the distinction to kind of say, I'm cultured, I'm of taste, I'm polite. This is not in contrast to colonial violence and class-based violence, but was its justification. So that's at the core. It is kind of justifying and rationalizing the subjugation of people exactly by declaring oneself capable of setting a certain standard of beauty and art, and denying others that standard, while still saying they have to play by the same rules, by the same, that kind of like, that's what Hume says, and that's quoted in the end, that everyone globally is capable of appreciating art in the same way. So this kind of, it's a principle that applies for everyone, irrespective of cultural and political and social context. But only some are capable of setting that standard, coincidentally, white men of class privilege. And so then I think the class exclusion that you point in your question, to me, is interesting, because now often we think that different social classes have different aesthetic preferences or interests, and kind of following the Bourdieu argument, it's the ordering of these cultural formations of taste that is a problem, that appreciation of sculpture is ranked higher than the appreciation of knitting or something like that. But this really shows that at the beginning of it, there was an interest in art across classes, and it was artists who worked to exclude people for no other reason than to not have them there. And so it was not, they didn't need the money. They put it in stocks, and then later they tried to charm the king with fireworks from the money they made. They did not need this for their own survival. They made money with the catalog sales, which is fine. The only reason, and they say it so specifically, is to exclude the audience that they don't want. And this is how the exhibition entrance fee was invented. And it's so clear, and some things that have stuck, like if you get a free leaflet, you pay an entrance, if you go to a museum, that has stuck for so long. And it came about in this really strange and petty and random way. And for me, I think one thing that I would like to say is that some things that we consider so normal now, by going back and seeing how they came about and how they were constructed, to me at least, it makes change easier to conceive of. And that's kind of the hopeful element that I see in it.
Thank you so much. I totally see what you mean, because I also think that there is this utopian moment contained in this first story. I mean, when this John Gwynne complains that stable boys and servants and so on are standing before the sculptures and the paintings, pronouncing their judgments, it's actually a very beautiful idea, I think. Yeah, thank you so much. Adriano, coming to your film. No, I try to pronounce your name correctly. Casablanca, very beautiful film. I really enjoyed to see it here on the big screen. The light is really beautiful, both in Umbria and in Casablanca. To me, this is actually a very moving love story, first of all. And it's interesting that it's a love story, but a melodrama, but a documentary. And I think that doesn't happen so often. And I was really wondering, do you call it a documentary, or is it more social realism? And the question is, of course, pointing to how much is scripted. How did you actually make the film? How did you meet Fuad and then Daniela and so on? That would be really interesting.
I live in a country where people, which is France, where people are kind of obsessed to find definition for things when it comes to cinema. And I think the only thing that is important is to be honest when you share your device in front of an audience. So I don't quite know if I should call it a documentary or not. This is a true story of Fuad and Daniela. I met Fuad while I was screening a movie of mine in Umbria. I went out for a drink during the screening, like I did now, and Fuad was next to me at the bar, and he asked me for a drink, and I paid him a drink, and we start talking. So it was very just someone. So that's this story. Everything is correspond to reality, or almost everything. I'll tell you about. Yet we shot the film over 5 years, because I met Fuad in 2016. We started shooting in 2000. I met him in early 2016. We started shooting in 2016, and we shot until early 2022. So, and sometimes I was spending time with a small crew and them just filming their daily life, and sometimes I would ask them to reenact things that I know that happen in their life, but never with a screenplay. Just, I know that you had the talk about religion. I know that Fuad had to move out. Can you speak about that? With a very light crew and trying to keep this, in a way they were reenacting their life. So I don't quite know the way we should define it. The only thing is that I'm very glad that you nailed the point that to me this is a love story, in the sense that this is obviously a very political film. I made a short film that ended up being very successful, and which was great and not great at all, because I thought that for the first time, it's my first documentary. I normally shoot fiction, and I thought I'm gonna show the life of these people. I was very inspired by the Spoon River anthology that you may know, when these dead people speak from the hill where they all under the grave, and they say, and they tell their real story in a little community, when you have the drunkards, when you have the prostitute, when you have the stingy person. And through this poetry, you manage to see a third dimension of the people, which in a small community like the one where they live is, you tend to just be, he's the drunkard and he's the drunkard immigrant and she's the drug, whatever. And so I felt that through cinema I could eventually give them a third dimension. And what happened is that it went very wrong, because they ended up in Venice. So they were on the red carpet. There were a whole full big theater clapping them, and it was a great moment for them and for me. But when they came back, the aftermath was horrible, because these photos, they were on national television. The photos were on social network, and and their life became, as it's a paradox, but much more complicated. You know, this fucking immigrants, they should not go to Venice, they should go back home. That was one of the, you know, quotation that I screenshot. And so for me, I was out of the project. I was like, this is enough. I'm not gonna, and I felt very bad. And then my producer pushed me to make a film about a director that tries to make something politically interesting and with value and end up making a disaster. But I didn't quite feel like being the anti-hero of my own film. And then we thought there was Meloni years in Italy early, you know, and so it's like, okay, maybe we're gonna make a political film. And in the end, after struggling a lot with the idea, I'm gonna keep on with this movie, not obviously with advantage that since the movie went to Venice and Toronto, we got money. And so I thought that the only way possible for me to make this film was to make a love story. And so I play with all the codes, which are sometimes fictional code with a very melodramatic Italian music and with the, you know, alternate editing between the two of them thinking about each other. So I know that I'm playing with that, but I thought it was a way to tell a story that still is very political, but maybe in a different way.
I really like that a lot. Yeah. So my second question to you would be, because I mean, the evening and the Woche der Kritik this year is about the issue of social class. Now, of course, you didn't choose to be here, but they chose you. But still, the question would be, there are so many interesting subjects, the questions in your film, like, of course, healthcare, migration status, question of belonging, feeling at home or not, having to go back or not. How do you see the question of class figuring in that? Or do you see it?
It's difficult. Okay, first of all, because it may not be clear for everyone, she is coming from an upper middle class. For those of you who speak Italian, she has a very, very good Italian, with a good research of words, and he's the son of an imam in a popular neighborhood in Casablanca. But the fact that he comes to Italy and we comes to Italy without paper, even if they both share a sort of desperation and they share the problem of being addicted and they share the problem of being outcast, that would connect them. Yet she has that house and she can live there. She eventually sold the house and now can live in a very decent apartment. It fully depends on, you know, he was really living in that factory. He was living there. It was so cold, and so there's a gap between them, which is probably more visible in reality than in the film. I don't. The only thing I can say, I don't know if I managed to do it or not, is that I found the problem that their life was so tough and so gray, and the place where they're staying is so gray, that I want to find a way to dignify it, because their inner life, not only their resilience, but their imagination, their faith, is their capacity of enjoying little things in life. It's so, their life in the end is very colorful in a very gray place. So I thought, and I gave myself, this is a part of the first question about fiction, I gave myself the freedom I didn't change the character, but I changed their environment. I was looking for lights. I was looking for pop elements. I was looking for this wheel. I was looking, for example, Fuad is normally working in the fields. And I just took the decision very deliberately to make him work in a bulling, which is not the truth. But if I was sticking to the real location, everything would have been a very gray films. When I felt that both the film and, in a way, their personality needed to be displayed in a more colorful way. These are fully fictional things that I'm really ready to accept. So, and this was a political statement. I think that there have been so many precious films, if you speak about social classes, about, we mentioned last night, Dardenne Brothers, the early Bellatar films, Mike Leaf, Ken Loach, we all know about this. And for so much time, the primordial thing was to speak about the survival and the primary needs of sub-proletary and immigrants. And those films were so precious. I think that now there's a new generation of filmmakers that try, in a way, to tell dreams and love and other things like primary needs because they are, and to build a universe where a more colorful universe, not like in the anti-Rosetta films when you deal with human problems, but and that's a political statement as well, and it's about classes, I believe.
Thank you so much. Maybe some of you in the audience are already looking forward to asking their own questions. There's going to be the possibilities, and there's going to be a microphone passed around. But before we come to that, I would like to talk to you, Sinthujan. So it was already mentioned in the introduction that you're the author of several books, including English in Berlin. So maybe this is a kind of field study. No. And you also studied social geography, and you worked, I think, in a kind of advisory board for the European Union in questions of asylum, and also different human rights organizations. So maybe you also have an interesting point of view in Adriano's film, I guess, and that I would be interested to hear your opinion. But since we haven't talked at all yet about the third film that we watched, the film from 1978, The Vampires of Poverty, I would really like to hear your opinion or your take on that film. Do you think that this is a film that is simply a historical document, or do you have the feeling that this really talks to us, like, about the current situation in a way?
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Well, it was first of all a pleasure for me to watch all of the films, and I'm the only non-filmmaker. It's a bit of an odd position to be in and to talk about others' films. I feel like the film was quite interesting to watch, specifically because I was surprised to see a mockumentary from that particular time. Because in my head, I think naively, I thought mockumentaries might be a more novel invention. But then to see the way of how they satirically approached this type of documentary, which was quite widespread at this point of history, but still is also, I found it quite bewildering, but also shocking that this type of critique already existed at this point of so-called history. And to consider the kind of like bluntness of the critique, and then to see how so little has changed actually in terms of how filmmakers, documentary makers, and reporters approach specifically poverty in the so-called global south. And what I really liked about it was also that the commissioning of the film was a German public broadcaster, because it really speaks to also how many German documentaries looked and still look, and how much fictionalizing there is. And I feel this kind of continuity between the fictions that we see on screens is also what connects us to colonialism, and a lot of the photography, the writing, and all kinds of other cultural production that have produced a worldview. And I feel like in the present even, we still see the ways of how this reinforcement of this particular like orientalizing gaze, but also otherworldly kind of like a rendering of the world. And I feel like when you watch a German documentary, oftentimes, and specifically like when it's outside of Europe, you hear phrases like between modernity and tradition, or a city that never sleeps. It's almost like fillers that have no real sense, because even if I go to a Marktplatz here, I see the church, and it's definitely not from modernity, but it's like these weird ways of kind of like creating a fiction and maintaining that fiction that I see in that film, particularly like how even at the very end, like that confusing scene with the actor who then comes, interrupts, and already there's a stage within a stage, which I found even more absurd, but also even more amusing, but also bitter to watch. And I think because it was also black and white, I think some of the elements of the kind of racial tensions and socioeconomic disparities within a so-called Colombia also didn't necessarily, I think, show, but I feel like the overall framing and the overall kind of like recipe of the film still is valid and relevant for the present.
This microphone. And so, in a way, what you say, well, this is maybe a permanent problem of representation. So whenever you film poverty, you're like, maybe it's always the possibility to create poverty porn. And so and then this is a question about film form and also maybe about context and institutions, about the public, so on. Would you say that like the three films, the three contemporary films that we saw tonight, actually answer in their own way to that problem?
I think so, yeah. I think specifically your film was quite, like, I really liked the kind of like lineage and the linear kind of storytelling of how all of these different aspects that we think of always as separates are so deeply linked with each other. And I think what you were saying in terms of like who produces art and then who consumes art is also similarly like who produces these films and who consumes them. And oftentimes the people who actually have the networks as well as the kind of like resources to produce these films and then to distribute them as well are not necessarily the subjects of the film. And therefore already the relationship and the inequalities within that relationship show. And it leads to kind of like an interpretation of someone else's kind of reality with which the person might have the influence to inform it, but not fully, because there will still be like a power imbalance. And I think that is something that is, I think, like quite present within the arts and culture generally. And I think also in the production of and rendering of culture, specifically institutional culture, as an elite form of production and manifestation, manufacturing of something, you know. And I think all three films kind of speak to that as well. And like as a viewer, I thought it was very interesting to even look at how you were curating them and putting them next to each other. Because in my head, I kept on thinking like, okay, I know the topic of the talk, but I'm trying to impose or implement it in the film and then understand like how did you bring these films together.
No, we have questions already. I don't see any hands raised. Maybe Friedl, you watched the Vampires of Poverty just now for the first time, or did you know it before?
At home, small, but
Sorry?
I liked it immediately.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I was astonished several times, and I approach you. If I like you personally, I was not so astonished at your film, also from the film form, because it seemed to be not filmic to me, as I'm a photographer, you know. And when I started to photograph, it were slideshows. So it seemed to be like a slideshow. And I think I would have preferred a slideshow. Nostalgia.
Like, you mean a real slideshow and then live commentary, for example? Or live
No,
performance?
there were also slideshows with music. I mean, it was not like a moving camera like in Vampires, for instance, and also yours. I mean, it's a melodrama. It reminded me of Italian operas. Yeah. Verdi, Puccini. And then I thought when I watched it at home, I even wrote some sentence. I thought, why didn't you do it? Because you mentioned now it is a situation now which brought you to make this film. So why didn't you do it on the situation now? Because you are also in this situation in public. And anyway, some people approached me during the Berlinale that I don't know what to do, and it's only not slavery anymore, it's an exploitation. And it could have been shown in the film too. I mean,
that would be another film, and maybe a film that
Of course.
Vika already made. The film I mentioned 3 years ago, Capacity for Adequate Anger.
Which is also a slideshow, so maybe I'm not.
It's another slideshow.
what were slideshows? Really? Analog
but-
film slideshows.
And
Yeah.
maybe, but this is also interesting in terms of the 4 different films that we watched tonight. They're not only different in terms of genre or film form, but they're also different in terms of for what kind of maybe dispositif they were made. Because, and that's, I guess, an important aspect of Vika's work is normally not shown on the big screen. It can be shown on the big screen, and I actually liked it on the big screen too. But you can also watch it like in installations, and that is, of course, a different situation. And also, I think that this is a film that you may need to watch several times. For me, it was very rewarding to watch it for the second and tonight the third time, because then what is, I think, one of the key moments that we talked about, this exclusion, has the story before that you mentioned, like the colonial story that is connected to that. But maybe, I don't know if you want to react to what Friedl said.
Yeah, how is the film which you did about the situation right now?
I can send you a link.
No, please tell us all.
The work that I made before, that you also mentioned, the capacity for adequate anger, kind of is more kind of a self-problematizing kind of take on kind of my first big institutional retrospective exhibition, and the reflections on kind of the problematic nature of upward mobility or class ascension in a way of like, it's also about affect, but it kind of like thinks, what is social justice? If we measure social justice by the ability to climb, by someone's fair chance to like move upwards. So if we measure usually like, yeah, social justice in terms of like, does someone have the chance to go higher? We that is like within this logic of representation to think, oh, a working class person made it, and now that person is exhibiting there. That kind of solidifies, or has the potential to solidify, the exclusive structure, but just becoming this supposed exception to the rule that at the same time also like justifies the structure. So I think that it's kind of like a work on that. And that is formally quite different. Maybe that answers part of your first question. Why they look so different. I think that personal work that, in which I'm also guilty of slideshow, is made because there's a lack of money I was working with. So I was working a lot with scans and pictures, and so this I just had more money to produce with because I had funding for, and then I can involve more people. So then I can afford to like actually invite people into the project and work with them. So that's why they look so radically different, I think. Maybe I want to segue into another question, though, because I'm interested in what you brought up about representation of misery. And I think there's like different things. I think also kind of this misery porn and like this kind of highlighting of misery. And the film that is not contemporary, Vampires of Poverty, kind of thinks of like the amplification of like this raw misery as a resource somehow, which echoes like some mid-2000s discourse in contemporary art, like around Enjoy Poverty by Renzo Martins, which some of you might know. And like to link this to the 18th century, I think there's two different ways. There's like this way of like looking at documentaries, like this pornographic way of like bringing out misery and using it as a resource. But then there's also art that transfigures actual social problems and misery into something that is palatable, that is consumable at a distance. And what I was interested in when I was looking at the specific historic moment was, why was this misery presented through the foundlings to people alongside art? What is that kind of compassionate gaze? And it turns out that the begging strategies in central London revolved about people like highlighting their misery, because wealthy people didn't believe they were actually in need. So they had to like really show, no, this is a real deep wound, and like this is actually like a sepsis or something. So they were really like highlighting and like producing their own legitimacy through performing their own misery, which I think echoes more now in like terms of like how the asylum system works, how like people have to argue that are in need of like gender affirming care, where it's about like proving difficulty. but then why people took a trip outside of London to look at art that was supposed to bring out compassion and pity, and to look at foundlings was another strategy. That is another artistic strategy to work with misery, is to transfigure it, to stage it, to kind of show it in a way that is not as difficult to look at. And I think that's kind of two different representational strategies of misery, either the pornographic highlighting of misery, or the transfiguration of misery, that within an art kind of world institution or within a cinema, you may look at someone else's problem and feel you've already done something by looking at it. And I think that's maybe when we talk about representation of misery, I'm interested in looking at these different strategies and what they do and what they don't, and what they reinforce and what they challenge.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. I think we have one question in the audience over there. Charlie, do you have the microphone? Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for the great talk. And it's such a pleasure, because occasions like this are still so far and in between to talk about class in the arts, in the movies, in the film industry. And this is a very hands-on, very practical question. As someone who's also active in literature, and I know of specific working class writers festivals in the UK and Italy, for example. And I was wondering on your opinion on how to open up your institutions and the arts you come from for more accessibility for working class artists, filmmakers, etc. Does it need to be a working class film festival? Does it need quotas, whatever? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that topic of accessibility to our institutions, filmmaking schools, etc.
This was a question to Vika? Everyone? Okay. You want to say something? Because you work in an art school, or anyone else wants to go?
I can start, and I try to be brief. I think one thing that is fundamental, which also brought me to this project, is that often exclusion has material roots. So while a lot of institutions have their outreach programs also in the UK, where a lot of funding is attributed based on what communities it can bring to a particular venue, while at the same time, as people are rhetorically welcomed, there are these high barriers and deterrents to keep people away at the same time. So this kind of double bind I think is crucial. And I think economic barriers are just main barriers. If museums cost more than what a lot of people can spend per day, then you can do all you want, people won't come, and people know what it is. And what I've often, there's something that I'm really against, is to think often accessibility in terms of class is thought it has to be more entertainment-like. We have to remove difficulty. We have to remove any theoretic depth, as if there wasn't a strong history of working class theory and philosophy and intellectual engagement. So I think this is something, and from teaching, I would say I'm really glad that I teach both students of art education and fine art, because often those who study art education know they can't gamble as much. They want to be in art, they want to be artists, but they also know they have to make a living. And these are the people I enjoy working with, and I think supporting people on their path, also in thinking mediation as a part of art making as well, would be one way.
I don't know this problem. I told you that I did not, that I started to work with 15, and that I did not study, and that I don't know. I founded 2 schools nearly without money, one for art photography, which was the first one in Austria, 1990. There was not even a department at the academies, and I felt this gap, and I did it in my atelier, which is 59 square meter. In 2006, I founded the School for Independent Film, because there was no school. And of course, a little money I got to invite and to pay filmmakers to have workshops or lectures. I earned very little myself, and my career in photography and in filmmaking, I did not have all these benefits which are necessary. And it worked. I even have a verlag. I thought all the people are kind of mourning. I don't have somebody who did my work. So I thought I'd do it myself. I only have 9 books now, small books. But I think it would be so interesting that you make, that you put the talk which you gave now into film with the students, with the 2 classes.
Come on.
You said you did already.
I wrote an academic article, but that's also not a film. But I'll think about it.
No, I think that there's been in the past, I would say, 20 years, a very important technological revolution, in the sense that, filmmaking has always been kind of an expensive art. Before you meet the audience, you need to find the money so that you can produce something that could eventually meet the audience, which is very frustrating sometimes. Then we can make films with less money in a very independent way. Yet, I think that cinema in the past 20 years has had an evolution that could make it join the so-called poor arts. A way to express with little means something that as a strength, as a power. And festivals are the democratic place where good qualities, idea, and things that, no matter how expensive the production was, but with the true energy and true, let's use the word revolutionary energy or whatever, can find their place. Because there's another economy of cinema, which is the mainstream cinema, and there I think is definitely not democratic and accessible in any way. You need to. And back in time, a lot of directors that we all love and that were so good in sharing history and class conflicts. Let's name Visconti, for example. Let's name Rossellini, if you say it. Let's name De Sica. They were all coming from very wealthy families. They could afford to, Rossellini sold a Renoir painting to make his his first film. Now things are different. Now really there's the energy can be conveyed in shooting with phones and editing on the computer and finding a festival as a platform to say how good you are, and eventually then accessing the biggest industry. And I think it's a very relevant point, this technological revolution, for making cinema more democratic.
Can I also add something? I think I really like quotas, and I feel like we live in a lot of societies and countries where quotas are something that people don't want to touch. And I also believe in redistribution of other people's wealth towards specifically those who are excluded and who are exploited. But when we think about it technically, because you also spoke about mediation, and when we think about museums nowadays, that a lot of them are opening mediation kind of offices, and they invest a little bit of money. And oftentimes you see the most marginalized societal members within those offices sitting there, underfunded, doing the most amount of work for the institution in order to get the most marginalized parts of society into the institution so that the pictures look nicer and so that the reports look nicer. And the same thing also happens, for instance, recently in Germany or in Berlin, they cut off the free museums on Sundays, right? And in the UK, when they implemented the free museum policy, the expectation was that it attracts more people from all kinds of societal backgrounds into the museum. But technically speaking, that was not the reality. It was quite the opposite. It just reinforced more of the same types of, visitors, while still maintaining that class and race barrier. So when you go into a British museum today, like the Tate Modern, you go into the general collection, you see the same types of people that you see in a paying museum, you know, but you won't see the periphery of London, for instance, in the same museum. And then they kept on kind of like figuring out or trying to understand how to pull in people. And one of the first issues is that these institutions are within the center of the city and within some of the most wealthiest inaccessible areas. To travel there, you have to pay a certain amount of, you know, like public transport. And then when you spend 2 or 3 hours and you go there with children, for instance, you have to buy food. And that food is overpriced, you know, and there's like all these other kind of barriers that really make it difficult for people to understand or to even access and normalize these spaces as part of their public space and their commons. And I think in Berlin, it's the same, even though we don't have ticket barriers, you know, like for in public transport, the tickets are still quite expensive, you know, and then there's like regulations that are really classist, like you can only take the BVG ticket towards one direction, but you can't do a circular move, you know, which doubles the price if you really want to return to somewhere, you know. And I feel like in the everyday, when we think about institutions, for instance, I lived for very long in Wedding, and Wedding had this like surge of new institutions opening, bookstores and galleries and other kinds of, even a cinema or a few other cinemas, you know. And I've also worked in juries, like public funding juries, you know. And every time these institutions, and having lived there, I've also like seen how these institutions thrive within these very marginalized kind of like spaces without really contributing to the people who live there. And most people don't even understand or don't even know what it is, or if they're even allowed to go in there, you know, and how much it costs and so on and so forth. But when you sit on the other side and you suddenly see these same institutions hand in their funding applications to public bodies like the Senate, you see them, all of them, like use their placing, their location as a branding. And then they will fictionalize some sort of benefit that their presence has for that very marginal area. And then Wedding becomes like a kind of like a slogan that you can kind of like monetize on. And then other people who are in the jury who don't come from racialized and marginalized economic backgrounds will be like, oh, that's a good thing, no? And then they will kind of greenlight that, you know? And many times I had to like block these kind of applications, having lived there and having seen that actually they're mostly also like agents of gentrification, you know? So I think there's also like a weird kind of like exploitation and also like a antagonistic kind of like relationship.
Yes, sure.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting that you bring the fact of education, because that's also not something that just started happening at some point. That is also just historically true. Also in London, like the Whitechapel Gallery was built where it was built because it was a poor neighborhood to educate and better the neighborhood. Like the idea of like changing neighborhoods through contemporary art institutions is like definitely something that has existed, and I really like that you bring up the Tate Modern, because I agree with everything you say, and architecture plays a huge role, distance, everything you say. But also the Tate Modern is like a really good example of like this rhetorically, it's free and open for all, but it's not. It has like this huge banner that says free for all. But then you go in, and as you go in, you're like nudged to pay by credit card like £5 to leave your code. You're nudged to like pay £5 for this, and you will find out that only the permanent collection is actually free. All the exhibitions that are changing, all the they're like £22. So I think even I walked in, oh, free for all, nice. And then even I was like, fuck, it's like £22 is a lot. This is not free. And that's kind of what they all do, is like this rhetoric of like free, but they're not. It's like, it's a really strange double bind.
But I think like the same thing happened in Berlin as when they
Yeah.
opened the museums on Sundays, right? You would expect that it would attract a different type of audience, but it just attracted more of the same type of audience, and all of them were kind of bargaining on that free.
Yeah.
And of course, there were some other people who had access to that, but I think like overall, I think if the content doesn't change, also like there was, for instance, in the UK, there was another example of the British Museum once having a Hajj exhibition, you know, and then suddenly having a completely different crowd of audience coming into the museum, you know, and then suddenly studies were made, you know, and commissioned to understand like, oh, how can the museum attract people that are historically excluded from the museum. And even to the point that you were making in terms of like making a contemporary work, I feel like having watched your work, I didn't feel like it was historic, because I feel like the past is the present and the present is the past. And all of these institutions that you talk about, they're present. And they even exist physically in the same way, you know? So to even understand the kind of systematic kind of like connectivity of these forms of violence towards the present, and the present has kind of rid itself of that past. So I feel like this was a very kind of like a powerful way of really reading where we are today.
When I saw your film at home in Vienna, I thought these masses, which were not wanted in the museum, you know, of prostitutes and workers and so, they are now in the museums. They are not prostitutes and workers, but they are completely uneducated, and you cannot look at paintings anymore. I nearly don't go to the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna. In the Louvre, I go only on the second floor, because downstairs are masses who have money, tourists who have money to come there. So it's an awful situation.
Actually, my job is really easy, because you just discuss among yourselves, but there are questions in the audience.
Sorry, can I go first? Is that okay? Okay. While you are talking, a thought came back up, which Friedl mentioned earlier, that your youth is always, or your childhood sometimes comes back to you when you grow up or grow older. And I kept thinking about this while you were talking, and also in relation to that idea of access. When I try to make sense of the question, like what access means beyond the material question, like psychologically. And I find it totally fascinating to think about Vika's film specifically in connection to that, because Vika, you and me, we come from pretty similar backgrounds. And the way you show me the art world resonates so much with the idea I had about the art world when I grew up. So you show me this like very hermetic space, which I don't understand, and following your film is really demanding for me still. So studying didn't help necessarily. So, and I find that choice like so fascinating, and I would really like to hear more about that choice you take to show us the art world in this way, like as an idea of the art world. And of course, we all know that this is not only the only part of the art world, but it's one part maybe of it. So that choice would be really fascinating to me. And also your irritation with Vika's film, Friedl, also fascinated me because what you talk about when you talk about a slideshow, I find very fascinating, because maybe it's connected to the idea of something which is not moving. So there's something static about a slideshow. And I wonder whether your irritation is maybe connected to the fact that some of the other films, and also yours, are based more on movement. So my idea of accessing the world would be connected to actually moving through it. So some of the films are really like moving so much, and Vika, your film is like showing us a very static framing, and it's connected to the art world. So I'd be fascinated to hear more about your experiences when you saw these films together, and whether the idea of access is for you connected to movement, or can you relate to my obsession with finding a psychological idea of access?
Yeah, being out of focus, for instance.
Yeah.
And I know how difficult it is what Vika made, because as I had been a professional photographer, I know that it's like 100 times more energy, maybe money also for the people and the dresses and everything, than if it would move around, and if they would, you know, and the camera moving. Yeah, but it is. Yeah, therefore I like the film Vampires of Poverty so much, because the camera was so different. Yeah, it's not only the movement. There are also films which are moving all the time, and it's too much. But it's a lot. It's really hard to do this.
Yeah, maybe Vika, I don't know. We have another question. Maybe you can answer that question later and hear the other question now.
Yeah, I think it was a really, really good question, which is also kind of in relation to what I wanted to say, because I think it's always very easy to preach to the choir in a sense, you know, because I think we all agree about the, I don't know, negative effects of gentrification, you know, of non-accessibility of art museums. But we also know a lot of people who do a lot of great work, you know, and who are really trying to make a difference. And for example, when you talk about galleries and wedding, I understand the critique very much, but I also wonder, you know, whether we could, for once, maybe not only blame and, you know, and point out all the bad or like the kind of problems in the sense that we all agree about it already, you know. And it's been said so many times, and I just think that, you know, for example, for certain gallerists, when they start working, we all know also that it's super difficult to get a space that you can actually pay the rent, you know. So to go to wedding is also a necessity for certain people who are trying to, you know, open a gallery, for example. And I mean, next to me is a curator, you know, from Martin Gropiusbau, where they actually really try to make a difference with, you know, changing the entrance, I don't know, opening up the space towards, you know, the project, etc., etc. So I would be very, I would appreciate to respond. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I also find this quite important, your point. Also because I think it's maybe easier to be critical than to do something yourself or to find a good solution. But I also believe that the problem is that we will always run into those dilemmata again and again, as long as we live in a class society. I mean, these are just problems that we can't solve like on the surface of the class society, like by trying to establish easier access or other means of access. As long as we have a class society and a class society that is actually that extreme in terms of inequality, we won't find good solutions. That's my conviction. I don't know if you want to go.
I think I disagree with the premise that we all agree that something is bad. Because I think a lot of times we rhetorically might agree with it, but it doesn't necessarily translate into action. Like a lot of, for instance, like a lot of spaces and places that are politically and ideologically maybe against something are part of that same problem. Like, for instance, like we all have an easy time, a lot of people have an easier time to talk about gentrification as an abstract, but they struggle rather to apply that to their own presence in a certain space, you know, like, and then to consider their own potential in being a gentrifier in a certain relationship, you know. And I think this ability to move from that abstract kind of like theoretical discussion to apply it to a very concrete example, I think is something that people oftentimes struggle with. And I feel like it's a cop out to assume that we all agree on something. And I've seen it like a million of times, you know, like where bookstores, for instance, have really, really good book talks, presentations about books that are so important in terms of like critical discussions. But then you think about their own kind of relationship within a specific type of like spatial reality, and you're like, well, I think you're part of the problem. But then it's a little bit interesting that you're hosting this talk as if you were not part of that, you know, and this kind of exclusion of yourself from the same issue, and even the fact that rents are cheaper in wedding. I mean, this is like the classical kind of like story, you know, and I think also like the exploitative, it is a fact, but I think it's also part of that exploitative nature of how art and culture produces and reinforces the same issues, that only to then have panel discussions and talks and I don't know, like exhibitions on the issue that they're part of. So I think this kind of like really almost not even cannibalist, but I think really like eating someone else because that's more convenient, like to punch down and to punch up. I think that attitude and that kind of pattern continues and reinforces, specifically when we keep on assuming that we all agree on this. And it's the same thing like when people say like racism is bad. Like we have schools in this country that say Schule gegen Rassismus. But does that really mean that racism is gone? It doesn't mean it. And I think to me, that is like one of these pitfalls when the rhetoric exists, but the rhetoric doesn't match actually the actions. And this is, I think, a premise that we also see in the current anti-AfD protest. We see so many tens of thousands of people, like come to the streets to protest something. Meanwhile, we have other protests in these countries towards, again, where the police and institutions attack Palestinian protesters and pro-Palestine protesters, and people separate these two as if they were binaries, but this is the same state institutions, and to me, this weird kind of like production of a separation and binary is part of that psychological schizophrenia that we oftentimes, I think, and especially I think in the arts and culture, exhibit and also are part of.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Also, your question. I think I do share some of your reservations against like critique as a method, or maybe like so I think it's also a methodological problem that you point to, like what is the position for which you critique and to whom, and what is the subject. At the same time, I would also say that to say that we all agree about these exclusions, I'm not so sure. I think what I'm interested in is to actually open another discussion about the role of the artist, because usually, and that's been like almost consensus in kind of like art theory for decades, that there's like some sort of pseudo-antagonistic relation between the artist, who's a potential agent of change, of good, of opposition, of instability, and there's like the institution that is somehow like this container of like everything that's bad. And so I'm interested in looking at this differently, of like not being in this like strange opposition, but to complicate the discourse by seeing what is the role of artists of building these institutions. That's why I'm so interested in this context, because usually we often think of like the institution to exist, and then the artist is dragged in, and then they compromise, they get they are in a position of implication somehow in the institutional violence or something like that. And what I'm interested in is to look at how artistic dominant desires, artist desires, build the exclusions in the institution. So that's kind of what I'm interested in. And it's also to think not as myself, as an artist, as like a potential agent of change who brings good and like who shakes things up in the institution, but as someone who has to really reflect on their own stakes in these exclusions and their own benefit in these exclusions, and how what is easy to like blame the institution for are maybe like kind of the bad desires, the bad secrets of artists that lie at this core in the institution. So I think I agree that like, okay, what's with that part, like what is it to be critical of institutions? And I think I'm more interested in being critical of the institution of the artist, kind of, and their role in perpetuating these forms of exclusion. So I think that's kind of what I'm trying to do.
Thank you. Yeah. I think there is one question, and I would maybe say that this is the last question for tonight, and then we're going to close this evening afterwards. I don't really see you.
I'm
up
here.
there. Okay.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this very interesting conversation. And I'm actually wanted to move back to conversation about the cinema a little bit more, because I thought it was so interesting at the beginning of this conversation when you, Adriano, were talking about portraying Fuad in this bowling working place. And I sympathize so much with your aesthetic choice to put him there as a means of going against the grayness. But at the same time, I felt to portray a person in a desolate, neon-lit entertainment area is such a typical, almost a little bit of a cliche way of portraying working class, And that made me wondering, but this is also a question I would like to pose to all of you in the panel. Like, how can you portray rooms of poverty without reinforcing the connotations, the negative connotations of class that they come with? That's my question.
Thank you. That's a very good question. And I think it's a very good opportunity for us to close the evening with the final answers to this very good question. Thank you.
Wow, but you give me a great responsibility after this. It's I've questioned so much what I could say and what I could not say about Fuad and his life, and when it came to these, I honestly look for aesthetical things, which I know, and that's why I stand up and say that it was kind of strong for me in a way to look for this solution. But it's very difficult to find an aesthetically correspondent of an inner feeling. And I know that it was very difficult to find for him a thing that, for the audience perspective, could not match with what is expected from him. And in that environment, it was, for me, very difficult to find something that was matching the expectation of the audience and correspond to his personality. That's eventually something that he did for a short time before, back in time. And I thought that was a solution that could, again, match my aesthetical need, some part of his background, but was far from reality. But this is not the only moment where I had to make choices. For example, there was something true belonging to his life, the fact that he played in a circus and he was holding things. And that thing is real, but at the same time, I thought it was exploitative in a way. And so, in a way, I was forced to try to put things that were not real, but could potentially match with the character. And that's the fictionalized part. You look environment that match with the character, and they were real, but I felt they were not good for fiction. So I was about to take this off because I felt it was too miserabilistic, but it was real. And somewhere else, I was trying to imply things from fiction that could match with my real character. And it's been, in general, coming from fiction and being for the first time in documentary and getting in time and still being so close to them, such a difficult challenge to try to make, there's this, Coutinho is this Brazilian director. It's interesting because the other film we watched was from South America, and he was speaking about raw beauty. And to try to stick to raw beauty and not to fall into porn misery or whatever you call. And I can name, we had a visit of Fuad at the dentist, and it's just about feeling that some shot could belong to the film, to give enough information to the audience to follow his story and to follow his drama and to just have the information to decode what was going on. And some other images, to my sensibility, were not acceptable. There's a line that, for me, was defining what was falling into porn and what was raw beauty. And every time I feel very fragile when I'm in front of the audience and when I watch the film myself, because I don't know how many times I managed to stay on the right line and to convey as many emotions as possible without going on the other part. And some images just could not go to the editing, and some images could not even be shot. I would take my DOP, go away. It's not what we can film. But it's a very fragile lines for me. And these questions for me are always I try to be honest, but they're always very difficult.
It's very interesting where that line comes from, or cultural
true.
it is, how coded it is, how much we are afraid of doing the misery or poverty porn. It's also very interesting that those are kind of codes we know. We shouldn't cross a certain line because it could be miserabilism.
But for me, no, just to say, it's
Yeah.
very it's never intellectual. Like we could analyze every single things from my film and from other films and question and speak about references and speaking about. But for me, it's something that is emotional. I watch an image, whether while we're shooting or in the editing, I say, this is possible, this is not possible.
Maybe just rather short concluding remarks on that question of aesthetics of poverty and the problem of choice.
I want to praise Adriano because with the title Casablanca, so you made Daniela into Ingrid Bergman, for instance, and Fuad into Humphrey Bogart. And this is also part of choices.
Yeah, and again, it's that no, really, what they're saved by faith and by humor, and so I thought that it could be in a good way to celebrate the humor in the title as well.
Sinthujan, do you have a shot? Okay. Vika, do you want to go about the aesthetic choice?
Yeah, I still want to
Yeah.
Does this work?
I think it does.
More or less. I still want to not end by signing up for kind of equating pornographic with problematic or bad when it comes to representations of misery. It's a tasteful representation of misery that doesn't make people feel bad and feels right. Does that change the spectator's relation to that misery in any way? And what does it do for those represented? I think I understand this kind of sensibility of, oh no, this is wrong and this is too much. But I think I struggle with kind of signing up for the word pornographic to stand in as a wrong kind of representation. I think it's one of the strategies that people use, but I don't think the other strategy of showing injustice or misery in a dignified way is a less problematic way of relating misery to the spectator.
I don't know. I'm very well aware that we have to close. Can I? Sure.
You have the last words now.
No, you have not. No, I think that the bottom line is that we are in a critics week, and I had the pleasure of listening last night to many critics and to have many intellectual, very interesting discussion. But I don't consider myself an intellectual. I consider myself someone that goes out in this world, meets people, and sometimes people and their story call me to make a movie, and I make a movie. And I struggle to find the money to make this movie, and I make it out of my sensibility. I'm very well aware that I'm a product of a society, of an education, and with all the fragility about this. And I'm very well aware. And I find my references, and I find my, a way to stand and to be here to speak about what we do. Afterwards, you need to talk to the press, and you need to meet the people, and you need to, in a way, codify your thoughts and try to make them interesting and potentially articulate. But for me, cinema has, and this is the political statement, it has to be just empathic or not. And whatever you can see is what I am and what I feel, which doesn't mean that I don't take criticism, because I keep on questioning myself, and then I feel my fragility. Yet I cannot talk I don't consider myself an intellectual about this, and I'm proud of not seeing my character in an intellectual way.
Okay, so those are the last words from the artist, not the intellectual. I would like to thank you very much for participating, for showing your work, for discussing your work, for engaging in debate with each other. And I hope you in the audience enjoyed that, maybe learned something, have interesting thoughts about class society, class struggle, exclusion in the art world, cinematic forms, aesthetic choices, and so on. This topic is going to be with us for a long time. As long as we live in a class society, we will always have to debate those questions. I would like to thank you for being here, the audience for coming here, and the organizers of Woche der Kritik for inviting me to be able to present this. I personally learned a lot and enjoyed the films, and thank you very much.